Let's go! Today we're doing a deep dive on the 2020 LSU recruiting class. Let me know down below, do you believe this is the worst class of Tigers ever? Please, because you can make a very strong case that it is, and I wonder if there's any lessons we could take from this big disaster. So I've been doing breakdowns like this on my SEC site for the 2021 Arkansas and Tennessee class. I'll link it down below. And as you can see, this was a very good transfer portal class for LSU. This is kind of at the beginning of the portal era, and Jabril Cox was definitely one of the best transfer linebackers LSU has brought in. Obviously, as a run defender, he wasn't really all that great, but as a pick-six merchant and just a turnover machine, he was unbelievable coming over from North Dakota State. Liam Shanahan, was he the best LSU center of the modern era? No, not even a top 5 center, but he did start at a very difficult position for 2 years with no viable backup, playing through a lot of pain and injury, coming over as an offensive tackle from an Ivy League school. I thought overall he was fine. And then, of course, Ali Gay, what else can you say about him? Was he probably a little overrated at times at LSU? Sure, but as a leader and as a consistent player, he was actually pretty good.
After the play, unsportsmanlike conduct. Throwing the LSU player's shoe 20 yards down the field.
Alrighty, so we get to our next batch of 3, Xavier Hill, Eric Taylor, and obviously the great Cole Taylor. Eric Taylor really didn't do anything. He had a good spring game, but that's about it. He transferred out before he ever really even played. I believe he's at Mississippi State now. Xavier Hill, once again, just mostly a backup offensive lineman, also really didn't do anything. And Cole Taylor, for the most part, even though this Florida game was actually pretty good, and he did actually have another good game in Gainesville 2 years later with Jaden Daniels, but outside of playing in Gainesville, Cole Taylor is mostly an inconsistent player, really struggled at the point of attack in the SEC. He went to West Virginia this year and actually turned out to be a pretty good tight end. Now we get to the most complex portion, which is TJ Finley and Max Johnson. We'll talk about Max coming up, but let's focus on this first batch of 4 players. Here's TJ Finley throwing the ball to Coy Moore, one of the 4 players we'll talk about here. We'll start with TJ, though. This first start was obviously incredible, and there were a lot of LSU fans that thought this was going to be the QB for the future. Obviously, TJ stuck it out versus Arkansas, but for the most part, really a turnover-worthy QB who has gone on to Texas State, has gone on to Auburn, won some games, some inconsistent play, lots of transfers mixed in there. Just an overall wild story. I will never, ever forgive that offensive line, though, for what they did to TJ Finley in the Texas A&M game. The worst single offensive line performance I've ever seen from LSU. You then take a look at a guy like Marlon Martinez, who is also a guy who has moved on. I believe he's at Mississippi State now. Floating in the top right corner of your screen, Marlon Martinez got away with one of the most disastrous bonehead decisions I've ever seen a football player make, and it would have cost LSU one of its most iconic plays in history. That video is floating in the top right corner of your screen. But outside of that, he was actually good. He stepped in versus Florida in that TDP historic game in 2021 and played at an extremely high level. So Marlon Martinez was a fine backup level player. It just didn't work out, and he's not a standard LSU offensive line starter now that Brian Kelly has increased the overall talent at that position. Alex Adams actually switched positions at LSU and eventually transferred to Akron, where he turned out to be an unreal productive receiver at that level. So it shows you how deep the wide receiver talent is at LSU, and that kind of ties in here with Coy Moore. He said the bonehead thing he said about Kayshawn now that Coy's at Auburn. He has transferred yet again. He's gotten beaten out on the depth chart by younger players consistently throughout his career. He is a really good starter-level wide receiver who is replaceable because he doesn't have the game-breaking speed, but the kid is unfreaking believably tough and overall was a fine LSU player. And I'm interested to see what happens next in his career. So 2 transfers here. Dwight McGlothern starting off here. It's just been a big loss for LSU. He transferred right at the beginning of the Brian Kelly era, and he had just 2 awesome seasons at Arkansas as he now tries to make it into the NFL. And this interception was huge in what was a pretty nice Florida upset, and he was able to take it to the house. And Max Johnson, we know what he did for LSU. A lot of gritty wins, including 2 versus Florida. You remember later in the year, the Texas A&M comeback. He was a really good starting quarterback and still is a good starting quarterback now that he's with North Carolina. So, got to give both of these guys 2 good grades, even though they left at the beginning of the BK regime. I'm going to be honest. The next portion is about to get really harsh because the next group of 5 players features 1 solid level player, but 4 colossal, and I mean colossal, misses. We'll start off here with Trey Bradford, one of the most bizarre LSU running backs of all time. Started off in 2020, rarely played. He was a part of the LSU Florida wins at the end of 2020. He left, then came back, then kind of left, and then if you would have said that Trey Bradford would have the first play, the first touch of LSU season, just for him to basically disappear for the rest of the year, it's still the craziest thing. And then we get to 2 pretty highly touted blue chip recruits in Josh White and Marcus Dumerville. Both were zeros, right? They just didn't do anything, and we'll see what Marcus Dumerville does at Maryland. I'm not so sure what Josh White is even doing now, but at this point in their careers, it was shocking that their star ranking was their star ranking. Jacobian Guillory has been a really good leader for LSU and a good rotational backup. He is probably under more pressure than anyone to take a massive leap forward, knowing that the defensive tackle depth is what it is. But going through all the different defensive line coaches that LSU has been through, he has been a key glue guy for this team. And then we get to Antoine Sampa, another zero for LSU. In fact, transferred to a school named Campbell. I don't even know where Campbell is. But just a tough run here. So now let's break down the 2 best players in this class. And one of those has to be B.J. Ojulari. In fact, I would say he is the best player in this entire crop. Another is Jaquelin Roy, who's eaten up this double. And you could make a very strong case that this was the most pivotal, momentum-shifting play of the season, right? When B.J. Ojulari strip-sacked Robbie Ashford in a game where the LSU offense was very non-existent, defensive touchdown, you rarely see those nowadays. He was so freaking good for LSU as a leader. As a year 1 contributor, obviously in the very first game of his career versus Mississippi State, all the way until his very last game. Obviously, year 2, there was a little bit of a lull there for BJ, but really when Brian Kelly came in and, Jamar Cain, they really put B.J. Ojulari in the right spot to succeed. And B.J., along with, obviously, Harold Perkins, took things over in 2022 for the LSU defense. And then, obviously, Jaquelin Roy is, in his own right, very underrated. I felt his 2023 wasn't as good as his 2022, but he was still very, very good. And then, once again, you have 2 other big zeros here. Jordan Tolles, who's now with the Baltimore Ravens, actually had a good career with Towson, but he did nothing at LSU. And then Philip Webb was another big-time blue chip, close to being a 5-star guy who did nothing. So we now get to the 5 stars, right? And these players are unfreaking believably complex, okay? But before we chat about their legacies, let's shout out our friends at nooffseason.com. Big time shout out to Paul Hickey and the Sports Card Strategy Show. They're the ones that help build my very extensive LSU card collection that we normally give out on live stream. So big shout out to nooffseason.com. Sign up for the Sports Card Shop mentorship, and they'll help build your collection as well. Now, let's talk about Elias Ricks. But before we do that, let's talk about some overall trends that I took away from this 2020 class. And if I truly do believe this is the worst LSU recruiting class of all time. Now, in terms of hit rate, it is not. And basically, I charted every single recruiting class of the modern era, so over the past 2 decades or so. And this did not have the fewest amount of hit, right? There's other hit rates that have been around that 40% mark. What I would say, though, is the blue chip bust rate for this class was really, really high. And that gets exacerbated. I don't know if I said that word correctly at all. I'm trying to use a big word. But that gets, honestly, magnified when your 3 5-stars all turn out to be absolute freaking studs, but at the same time, they turn out to be head cases, right? Look, he was good in year 2, even though he was playing through a shoulder injury, and then obviously transferred to rival Alabama. And kind of like what Coy Moore did in 2022 for Auburn, handing LSU a victory, Elias Ricks helped LSU in that overtime 22 victory when obviously BTJ sent him to the underworld. But the bottom line is Elias Ricks was a good LSU football player, but his legacy, of course, is tarnished going to rival Alabama. Then you get to Kayshon Boutte. There's no other way around it. At his peak, he was as good as Malik Neighbors, as good as Jamar Chase. But obviously the injury versus Kentucky was very unfortunate, and so on and so on. And then, of course, all the off-the-field drama. That's a part of your legacy, especially this last episode. So Kayshon is all-time great talent. And then we get to the biggest of them all, Eric Gilbert. Now, if Eric would have played out his career, I don't even know if he would have been better than Ojulari or even a Kayshon, who was just unfreaking believably elite when he was locked in. And the same thing for Elias Ricks, but we'll never know. And Eric Gilbert was the mutant of this class, the highest rated tight end prospect of all freaking time. And you saw glimpses of excellence, right? On a per game basis, he's one of the most productive LSU tight ends ever. And look, the guy's blocking did get better throughout the course of the season, but like Kayshon, I mean, you would have never thunk that their legacies would have ended the way that they ended, knowing how their careers started in 2020. So, obviously very unfortunate. Kayshon, at least, he never got arrested. But both of them, just bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. So, look, this was just a total meltdown by this 2020 group, but that's what happens when you lose. And obviously LSU started this 2020 season 0-2 during a tough time in the world. But, man, Eric Gilbert would have been so freaking special at LSU. But that's why a guy like Mason Taylor came along and made it easy to forget about Eric Gilbert. So comment down below. Let me know what you guys think. If this is the worst LSU class of all time, I would lean no. I'll tell you in our next live stream, which might be starting pretty soon here, who I think the worst class actually is. But there were definitely some really, really, really good players in this crop as well. It is Power Hour LSU. Boom. And tonight we're doing chicken quesadillas. Let's go.